The Battle for Uber. I'm Tonya Hall, and joining me is Mike Isaac, New York Times technology reporter and author. Welcome, Mike.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, welcome. I'm so excited to talk to you. We've got so much to talk to you about today. But before we get started into anything else, let's just back up and give us a brief summary of your history and your work as a technology industry reporter.
Yeah, sure. So I completely fell into the space without really thinking I was going to go into tech. I ended up coming out to the Bay Area from Texas and went to school at UC Berkeley and studied English and really was like, I wanted to be a writer of some kind, but I didn't quite know, and mostly was just serving coffee. And got a job writing for Forbes online when right before the Facebook and Twitter IPOs started happening. And they were like, hey, we don't have anyone covering Facebook and Twitter. Why don't you just do that? And I feel like I lucked out because they suddenly became some world-changing companies that were huge. And from there, I just sort of kept writing about tech. It was Wired magazine, and then a site called All Things D, which became Recode, and then joined the New York Times in 2014, and have been covering Uber and Facebook and tech companies since then, basically.
Your book, Super Pumped, The Battle for Uber, was recently released. And I have to say, the book is substantial at almost 400 pages, but it even reads like there's more than 400 pages of stories within the book. What was your strategy in relating narrative as complex as this?
Yeah, it's so I decided to write the book probably in 2017, right after or during the middle of Uber's nightmare year when it was going through scandal after scandal. And when I signed the contract, I wanted to make it dig a little bit more into the nuance of who Travis Kalanick is, what these characters were like, really like why Uber became this huge company, but also fell so far, like in the 2017 after a series of scandals just kept hammering it. And I feel like I had to do a real character study and explain how it was built and why it was built at the time it was built and why it worked for so long until it didn't. So, I think it would have been easy to make Travis a kind of cartoon villain character, and I don't think that's what he is. I think he's more nuanced of a person. Funnily enough, people say that they almost found themselves admiring or feeling sorry for him at certain points when they were reading it, even though they didn't like him when they started. So I just wanted to get at what the motivation was for him and what he was doing, and then really lay it out before we get to some of the real action later on.
There's an extensive amount of research behind the story. How did you, to build this up? And I know you wanted to really dig into it. How did you gain access, though, to so many people and so much data?
Yeah, I think I built up a number of sources since 2014. So I had 5 years at least I guess 3 years since I started the book in 2017. But I had some time to build sources. And I think a lot of it just in journalism, as you probably know, is like stories lead to more stories, right? And so I was lucky that I was following Uber really closely during 2017 when, all the scandals were happening, and sources kept coming out of the woodwork and finding me to be like, oh God, I got to tell you this thing, or this is the next crazy thing that no one knows about. And then I think once I announced that I was doing a book, it really, I know you guys have a lot of authors on, it really does give you more leverage in the types of people who are willing to talk to you. I think executives feel the sense of finality, or at least like this is going to be the definitive, history of this company, or like this is how things went down. And if I'm someone who may not come off very well, I want to tell my story. You want them to get in front of me to talk about it. Some people would talk to me, some people wouldn't talk to me, but I think I had enough leverage there to get to more folks over time. And I think you have to be strategic and sort of say, if you don't talk to me, this person's going to tell your story and not you. So you might want to do it. So it ended up working in my favor. It was still, there's a lot of people, so keeping that all like organized was tough, but it ended up working out all right.
One of the characters in the opening of your story is Grayball. Grayball makes another appearance even later in the book. But explain the software tool, the story behind it, and how it really foreshadowed so much of what was to come.
Yeah, so back in 2017, when I was reporting on the company, I had a source come out of the woodwork and basically explain this piece of code, software tool that Uber had created and codenamed Grayball. And, it was originally internally used for a non-shady purpose, but then some Uber employees manipulated that. And what it basically does is allowed employees to target different, officials or folks using the Uber app and serve them up like a different version of the app that wouldn't actually allow them to call cars or show like ghost cars inside of the app and make it essentially difficult for someone to call cars at all. Now, the reason they needed it is because if you remember back in 2014, 2015, Uber wasn't at the point it is now where it's basically ubiquitous. It was still pushing into cities. Laws around ride sharing didn't really exist. They would be in these knockdown, drag out battles with different transportation officials. So, instead of playing by the rules and abiding by the laws and trying to get things worked out with the government, they decided to just bypass them completely using this software tool. And it worked. It worked for a long period of time before we uncovered it in 2017.
And you really drill down on that. You talk a lot about the relationships and the nuances in the story. It's really interesting to follow. So I hope people will enjoy that. It was also a little alarming that they had so much access to so much data, but
Yeah.
that's you have to get the book to really read that. Tell us how leather jackets and a blog post by a female reliability engineer sent shockwaves through the company and Silicon Valley.
Yeah. So again, back in 2017, Uber's nightmare year, they had just started going through some scandals internally. There was a moment where it looked like they were ripping off or sort of trying to, profit off of the backs of a protest at these airports when Trump brought down the travel ban. There was an engineering manager a VP of engineering who was hired from Google. Then it was found that he had allegedly sexually harassed a woman at his old company. There was just Waymo versus Uber lawsuit, like you name it. There was one thing after another that was a nightmare for this company. Then a woman named Susan Fowler, a former employee at Uber, decided to write a blog post after she had left the company, just kind of detailing her history of being a worker there. And she had never really made peace with the way the culture was at the company during her time. And she had already gone on to work at this company called Stripe, which is another Valley company. But she had really sort of grappled with how unpleasant things were inside of Uber. And to give an example of that, the first day on her new engineering team, she sat down at her computer and her manager started hitting on her and opening his open relationship into, asking to join it essentially. And then there was this moment with leather jackets, basically just sort of the men on her team were able to get this series of, custom made leather jackets while the women were not because it wasn't cost effective. It really laid bare the sense of inequality among the sexes inside of this company. And in a very, detailed blog post. And this was, the blog post heard around the world, basically. This was primed before the Harvey Weinstein allegations came out later that year. And just as the rise of looking at the deep-seated sexism ingrained in the tech industry, this was the thing that really kind of kicked that off. And it ended up blowing things up from the inside over at Uber.
Absolutely. And as you pointed out, it was really pre-Me Too movement. but it really was foreshadowing, I think, as to what we could see, and kind of this finally uprising to say no more, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I absolutely credit Susan's posts with just sort of igniting this greater movement, you know, and at the Times we had reporters covering Hollywood, obviously, but other parts of Silicon Valley where this sort of systemic inequality, systemic sexism, systemic harassment was going on. They ended up winning a Pulitzer for that. But I really do think that momentum just built upon itself and kept going from there. And while the Harvey Weinstein stuff was you know, groundbreaking and blockbuster, I think people kind of forget that there were some seeds that had started going off earlier in the year as well, including Susan.
Something else you talk about in the book is the relationship with Apple. What was the problem with Apple?
So Apple is, I mean, it's an interesting and powerful company, right? It's kind of like a kingmaker in the industry. And I think every app inside of the App Store has to sort of not run afoul of Apple, where they risk their business tanking or whatever. So essentially what happened was Uber had a serious amount of fraud going on in many of its cities around the world, especially China, though. And so they created this system where they could sort of what they call fingerprint iPhones, so that when scammers would erase a phone and try to sign up for another fake account and then start scamming Uber out of millions of dollars, Uber would be able to track and see if those iPhones had been used before to do this. Now, Apple had eventually outlawed this practice just because Tim Cook is a real strong believer in privacy and individual privacy of its users. And if you erase your iPhone, it should have no trace of you on it whatsoever. The problem was that messed up everything for Uber and its ability to fight scammers. So unbeknownst to Apple, Uber's engineers found a workaround where they could keep Apple in the dark by essentially geofencing the Apple headquarters to not show certain versions of the app update to Apple's reviewing engineers, which is like a huge no-no inside of Apple. And it ended up in a big confrontation between the two CEOs of the companies. And Uber was very close to getting kicked out of the App Store, which could have cratered its entire multi-billion-dollar business. It was crazy.
Yeah. And I guess, you know, one of the big takeaways ultimately, this book is about Travis Kalanick, a pathologically obsessive genius, unencumbered by a conscience or ethical grounding.
Yeah.
How could an organization built on deceit, immorality, intimidation, and political backstabbing be sustainable? I mean, Travis is a smart man. How could he not see the error of his ways?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point. And right now, Dara Khosrowshahi is the new CEO in charge. He's trying to sort of push this narrative of we're a new company, we're Uber 2.0 or 3.0 or whatever. We're going to do the right thing, period, right? And I think, you know, to be fair to them, a lot of the real bad actors have left the company. Some were pushed out in an investigation into the conduct of employees. But at the same time, I think it's difficult to change the DNA of a company from the very beginning, you know, and like the scrappiness, the willing to bend or even break the rules in a lot of different countries. It's just, you know, that a lot of that can be institutional knowledge put into employees around the world. And not everyone is left. So like, I don't know which ones are, you know, good or bad or whatever that are still left. But it's really, I look at companies like Twitter, you know, which has been sort of dysfunctional from the beginning and still has problems to this day. And I think about how DNA can really stay for a long time. So it's a good question. And now, you know, to be fair to him, it's on them to prove it and see if not only their culture can be sustainable, but their business model can be sustainable in the long term.
Travis didn't collaborate with you on this book. So how might that have benefited him if he had? I mean, were there things that he could have learned from your findings, maybe?
Yeah, I think it would be, I think Travis, I would love to have interviewed him and let him tell his version of it. I'm sure there's a bunch of things he would see differently or whatever. I had this, you know, strenuously fact checked. So, you know, it's just to make sure everything was accurate, but I'm sure he would have his version of events, and I would be, you know, I would love to see what that looked like, basically. Maybe someday he will tell his version of events, who knows, but not yet, at least.
You'd been following Uber long before you wrote the book. What fact or revelation did you uncover researching that was the most surprising to you?
I think probably the amount of violence and literal murders and deaths that were occurring with regards to its drivers. There was a moment when they pushed into South America, and Brazil in particular, during Brazil's probably one of their worst recessions in its history. Unemployment was skyrocketing, poverty was through the off the charts, and Uber dropped its service into the market, and it's a largely cash-based economy over there. So they would basically have these drivers with huge wads of cash driving around, and Uber scammers could call up these drivers and give a fake name and basically have a rolling ATM come over to their house. And so the scammers would rob the drivers filled with cash, sometimes steal their car, and in some cases actually murder or beat up or whatever the drivers, and get away with it because Uber didn't have proper identity checks for riders. So it was really like pushing the edge around safety and doing this for some time until they started reining it in. It was very disturbing.
That is disturbing. Okay. To follow that, you just kind of reflecting on what maybe you've learned from this whole entire writing experience. What advice would you offer founders to be about starting, funding, and running a sustainable enterprise?
Yeah, I think I would just say, like, what I hope people take away, and I've actually talked to a few different founders as I've been touring for this book, and as they've sort of come up after during signings, and they tell me, like, look, one guy asked me to sign the book, don't build it like this, or like, don't build your company like this. And I think that's poignant. Like, there is a whole generation of founders who want to be entrepreneurs, who still look to Silicon Valley as a source of inspiration and a place where they want to build the next great thing. And I think just being more conscious from the beginning on the type of company you want to build and be proud of, and what your culture looks like from the start, whether you have a staff that reflects the values of your organization and the types of users that use your product. All of these things, I think, to the extent that you can, should be thought about or very intentionally from the beginning of that company. Even if it's a small startup of like a handful of people, it's still something I think that is worth thinking about. And it's giving me hope that, like, at least some founders I've talked to are being more intentional about it too.
Yeah, I think you've opened a lot of eyes. I certainly think the story has. Mike, seriously, this is an amazing book. It's very difficult to not want to even reread the book.
Wow.
There's just so much content, so much information. Thank you for writing it. If somebody wants to pick up a copy, maybe they want to connect with you personally, how can they do that?
The easiest way is probably through my Twitter account, at Mike Isaac, ISAAC, and or they can go to my website, mike-isaac.com.
Sounds good. Thanks again, Mike, for joining.
Yeah.
And if you guys want to, yeah. And I follow him on Twitter, so I totally think you should follow him. He's great. Man knows how to tweet. And if you guys want to find me, you can. Again, that was Mike Isaac. Pick up a copy of his book. I did, and I also have it on Audible. I highly recommend it. Mike Isaac, New York Times technology reporter and author of Super Pumped, The Battle of Uber for Uber. If you guys want to find me, you can. You can do that right here or go to tonyahall.net. Thanks for watching.